This is the Witness and Persecution Podcast with Nik and Ruth Ripken. I'm your host, Anthony Ball, and today's episode is going to be a particularly powerful episode on grief and hope as we welcome very, very special guests, Tim and Aileen Challies. Tim and Aileen are joining Nik and Ruth in the studio today, so allow me to introduce them to our Witness and Persecution audience. Tim, this is directly from your website, so I hope that that's okay that I've grabbed this information. But Tim is a prolific Canadian blogger, author, pastor, and speaker who has been posting daily on his blog since 2003. Tim is married to his wife, Aileen. They have two daughters, one of whom is married, and a son who is waiting for them in heaven. And now, Tim and Aileen, your son who is waiting for you in heaven is really the catalyst for this conversation, this episode today with Nik and Ruth. And our listeners are going to be very familiar with Nik and Ruth's story of Timothy on Easter Sunday morning in Kenya. And so as we kind of intermingle these stories together today, we're praying and hoping that it's just a very, very God-honoring episode, a God-honoring conversation for those who may be walking even now and listening to this episode, walking now through grief and trauma. And we know, we mentioned this a little bit before, but we know that there are people who have brought feedback to us even through our Witness and Persecution podcast. We've encountered people who have lost children in the womb. We've encountered people who have suffered deep trauma and grief on the mission field. Of course, with Witness and Persecution and the Insanity of God's story and the Ripken story, we have interacted for decades. They've interacted for decades with those who have suffered unimaginably for the cause of Christ. And so we want to bring these stories together today and hopefully touch the hearts of many around the world. And so Tim and Aileen, welcome to the Witness and Persecution podcast. We're so glad that you're here. Tim, you've written a book called Seasons of Sorrow, where you document Nik's passing in 2020 and your subsequent journey with God through that process. And so Tim and Aileen both, you've both written and spoken quite extensively on this over the last 4 years. But let's start out by asking you to share a little bit of your story. And for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with it, share a little bit of your story and kind of what has led for our conversation today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having us on. I guess our story begins with the Lord granting us 3 children, the oldest of whom was Nik, our oldest child, our only son. And he professed faith in the Lord when he was a young teenager, and shortly thereafter really felt that the Lord was directing him toward ministry. And so he went down to Louisville, Kentucky, where he studied concurrently at Boyce College and the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he was looking forward to pursuing a lifetime in ministry, had just become engaged to a nice young lady and was in his 3rd year there studying. And when November 3rd, 2020, just very suddenly, unexpectedly, he collapsed and passed away. He was with his friends at the time, with his sister, fiance, just playing some games together just off campus, having a fun evening out with the dorm, and collapsed and was gone. Nobody was able to help him, give him assistance at that time that was useful. So, the doctor said later there was some sort of heart condition. They've never been able to figure out exactly what it was. Maybe future studies will find out what it is. But for now, all we know is that the Lord very suddenly in his providence took him from us back then in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nik and Ruth, why don't you, I know some of our listeners are familiar with your story, but also a lot of those who might interact with this podcast from Tim's audience and Aileen's audience, they may not be very familiar with your story. So can you give us a little bit of a background of your story? And a lot of your story with your family is what launched the Persecution Task Force and discovering how Jesus is working in these places. So share a little bit of background of your story as well.
Our Timothy developed asthma when he was about 7 years old, and we had moved to Kenya and were working there. We had been ministering inside of Somalia, but living inside Kenya. And it was on Easter Sunday morning, the middle of the night, right before, the morning, and Tim just came down with a horrible asthma attack because the rains had started, and so a lot of the mold and the issues that come when the rains start in Kenya caused that horrible asthma attack. And Nik rushed him to the hospital, and on the way he did CPR and all that, and then he got him there. The doctors did what they could, but he did not survive that asthma attack. So he had just turned 16 about 2 weeks before that, and so the grieving that took place then was just unbelievable, as we can talk about.
Absolutely. Well, Tim and Aileen, I want to ask you this, and I'm going to also ask Nik and Ruth the same question. But when we have interacted with these stories, a lot of the things that come up, one of the things that comes up to the top was how did the church respond? How did the church help? I know, Tim, I'm not very familiar with Canadian culture. Nik and Ruth, of course, have lived really more overseas than they have in America. And so American culture can be very isolated, very individualistic, and we can also be very isolated in our grieving, which is the opposite of what the church is supposed to do. So let me ask you this: how did you see your church respond? What was the process like walking with your faith family?
Do you want to answer that one and give a bit of the COVID context?
So unfortunately, in large part, in November of 2020, COVID was still very much a real thing. And so because we had to travel down to the US and then back across an international border, they required us to quarantine for 2 weeks. So we didn't really have a whole lot of contact with anybody through that 2-week period. And then we were in and out of lockdowns for the next 6 months after Nik died. So we didn't have a ton of church involvement. They were amazing in what they were able to do, but because of circumstance, they weren't able to do a ton. We had people outside our front door with signs. I still have a few of them.
Wow.
And we were distanced in worship. We were allowed to meet outside with people. So we did a lot of walks occasionally as well. But unfortunately with our context, because of the timing, it just wasn't that easy.
Wow.
I think one of the things you observe, Anthony, is that I don't know that modern Western culture has good social norms related to grieving, at least when compared to other parts of the world. And part of that, maybe in the Toronto area, is we're so multicultural that nobody really knows what to do. They know how to do it in their own culture, how to have a very Canadian traditional funeral or a West African funeral or an Indian funeral, but people don't really know what the new norm is for us as a church in a massively multicultural context. And so that's something we've been trying to help our church with, is how can we grieve well when there are opportunities to do so? How can we love one another through grief in ways that maybe transcend every culture?
Wow. That's incredible. And, I didn't even really put together 2020 and COVID. And so that really does change the dynamic. Nik and Ruth, I want to ask you the same thing. You have a couple of years on Tim and Aileen, but I'd love for you, because I know the story, you document in the Insanity of God, but a lot of people may still be unfamiliar with the response of the Kenyan church after Tim's death. Can you give us a picture of your church process during those initial days and weeks of grieving?
Well, we got, like Ruth said, God provided an Indian angel, because on my trip to the children's hospital with our son, and our cat wants to be in the podcast, I knew that that Timothy had stopped breathing, and I needed to get in the back seat and work with him, and it was like 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And of course, in Africa, you don't drive at night. You don't have street lights. You don't have stripes in the road. People you get up when the sun comes up and you go to bed when the sun goes down. And so I was driving by the largest shopping center near Sanctua Mall that we had at that time in Kenya. And all of a sudden the gate opened and a car pulled out. And I saw this Asian guy get out and shut the gate to the whole shopping center. And I pulled over and blocked his vehicle. And he thought probably we're going to jump out and hijack him or something. But I jumped out, told him what was happening. He left his car, got in the driver's seat of our car. And with me working on my son in the back, he drove us to the children's hospital. And then he disappeared. I've never seen him since. He never showed himself. And though we had a lot of folks from that shopping center that knew us and knew Timothy, because Timothy liked to go there and bargain with the Kenyan curio people, even though he had no money. And he'd do that for hours, and they loved him dearly. And we had Hindus and Muslims from that shopping center come to his funeral that he had witnessed to, as a 15-year-old, maybe younger. And yet the doctors were working on him. And I watched and I went over and I said, listen, this is not working. He's always recovered by now with this kind of treatment. And if there's something else you can do, you better be doing it. And so a bigger team came, they went upstairs, and I called my wife, and she and our oldest son and a friend of ours came to the hospital, leaving our 11-year-old asleep back at home. And then finally, we didn't hear anything. And I took Ruth, our oldest son. Did he go with us upstairs? Well, I've written that out of my memory. And we went upstairs, and there they sat as despondent as they could. And they just were too broken to come down and tell us. They weren't able to save his life. And that began a very long night, a long process of calling people once we got home in, 6-7 hours difference in time zones. And with Ruth's brother and sister-in-law, that was probably closer to 10 and 11 hours. And I think the hardest thing that we've ever done in connection with, in a way, it wasn't harder than our son's death, but waking our youngest son up the next morning and breaking the news that he didn't get to say goodbye to his brother, and that he had died in the night. And his response was just overwhelming brokenness. And after we talked for a bit, all of us sort of in arms around each other, I said to them, kids, your mom and I have talked, and this is not something we would ever want to have happen. But now that's happened, we're going to make a commitment as a family not to waste it. That was in March, right after, like she said, right after his 16th birthday. And we went home to put our oldest in college a few months later after graduation in June. We never fixed another meal. Now, we did breakfast ourselves, but our Hindu neighbors, our Muslim neighbors, there's a lot of mission organizations in Nairobi. Food came from everywhere. But I think there's 3 pictures, and Ruth may add to it, that sticks out clearly to me. One is these rains continued. They go for months and months. And I walked by our oldest son's bedroom door, and there were like 13, 14 pairs of muddy shoes outside of his bedroom. And I thought, where in the world are the kids that go with all these shoes? And I went in there, and half the senior class was in the bathtub, sitting on the seat of the toilet with clothes, sitting on the sink, sitting in window wells, sitting on the head of the bed, all over the bed, on the floor. just loving on our son and caring for him. The second photo that I remember, that event was one of the things I do say, though we didn't eat another meal, I found out that every culture loves to make casseroles. Hindus, Buddhists, it doesn't matter what culture you are, what you got in your refrigerator, put some stuff in it and fill it up, put it in the oven, and you've got yourself a casserole for grieving people. And I've never enjoyed casseroles since then. I don't have good memories of them and the taste for them. But on Thursday, it was so much traffic, just the opposite of what Tim and Aileen had. It is we had so many people come in that we took turns answering the door. And late on Thursday afternoon, near dusk, there was a knock on the door, and I opened it. And our Somali chief of staff, whom I'd called on the radio Easter Sunday morning and told him that I couldn't come in, that Timothy had died. He had just dropped the radio microphone, and he began walking. And this Muslim man walked 5 days through the bush, through the desert, hid in brush. His clan fighting went around him. I had to skirt landmines, rode in the back of a goat truck, rode on camels, and showed up completely. His lips were so cracked, he was so dehydrated, he couldn't bleed. And I asked him, where in the world have you come from? And he straightened himself up with all the pride he could muster. And he said, I have come to bury our son, Timothy. And the second day, why don't you tell him about Ridgeways?
Well, I think that's what we were thinking about as we were talking. What role did the church play? And our Kenyan church came every night, came into the living room after all the other people had left our house, and they sang us to sleep every night. So that was the role the Kenyan church had. And then the church, the global church, they ministered to us through phone calls and emails and the things that Tim and Aileen were talking about, those calls, those notes, those letters, that many of them were just, I have an entire container of those kinds of letters. Then there was the church in the States who took care of getting my brother to come over, because my mother was dealing with cancer at the time and she was near death. And so we couldn't have our whole family together for the funeral. And so the church in the West took care to get my brother and a church member over to be a part of the funeral. And so I think that's a role that we saw the body of Christ minister in lots of different ways that carried us when we couldn't carry ourselves.
We got, I can't remember, between 6 and 10 boxes of sympathy cards. Wow. Thousands of cards from all over, especially America, but all over the world. And I still haven't gone through all of them. I never could make myself just go through that many thousand. And when Ruth's mother died, 2 months to the day that our son died, she had flown home earlier and had special time with her mom and said goodbye. But myself and our boys never got to say goodbye to Ruth's mom, and she was our number one connection with everything that was in America.
Wow. I'm not sure I know what year it was. What year did...
It was 97.
97.
In 2 months, Tim died. We got kicked out of Somalia, and Ruth's mother died. And so in that 2 months, and then leaving Kenya and losing our ministry, burying our son there, leaving all of those friends and not knowing what the next step was going to be, not knowing that we'd never live there again. There was just sort of grief compounded upon grief. But I would take our part of that story, because at each step of the way, we had people that were grieving so much in America and in Kenya that wanted a part of us. We didn't have enough downtime to grieve by ourselves.
Wow. Now, Tim, you mentioned something, and I want to follow up on that because I hear Nik and Ruth's story of walking the church, walking them through the grieving process, the healing process. And I completely agree with you. I don't see, I wouldn't say the Western culture, Western church necessarily go to that extent to walk people through very difficult and traumatic experiences. And so what did that process of healing look like for you? And maybe what would you, I know you've written about this before, but what would you maybe challenge the Western culture, Western church? How would we help people grieve better and process these things better?
Yeah, good questions. One thing that comes to mind is that I think in 1997 was maybe the tail end of the era of greeting cards. 2020 was the front end of the era of text messages. And so I think something's been lost along the way. And it's great to send somebody a text message and say, I'm praying for you, or I'm sympathetic.
And phone
But I do
calls
think
and all
we
that,
have
which we don't.
a big container of cards, and those are very meaningful because they are a little snapshot of somebody's love and care and concerns. And when your iPhone goes, your text messages tend to go as well, but those cards have a little more permanence. And so there's one thing there. I think some of those old traditions of sending flowers or sending cards or physical presence, just being present. And again, we were in unique circumstances. This was in the very front end of the pandemic when things were still very uncertain and unknown. And so there were very tight lockdowns in our area and pretty significant penalties if you violated them. And hence we were really locked down. And so the church couldn't extend that love. And I know that grieved them as much as it grieved us. And we had some very significant moments, like a little time in after Nik died, when we were able to go to church and see that our church members were grieving with us, that it had been their loss as well. And that was very meaningful for us to know that they were grieving the loss of one of our own. One of the young men of the church, as one of the ladies said, he was ours. And then at the 1 year anniversary, by then things were much more open and we were able to have a little service at the graveside at that time. And that was a very meaningful moment, the sort of thing that should have, by rights would have happened a year prior. And that was, again, a very meaningful communal moment where as a community we grieved and sang and praised God and wept together. And so,
where was your son buried?
Near us. So we were able to have his remains returned back to Canada, and he was buried just a short distance from here.
I went to Southern twice, and we still speak at Boyce and at Southern, and we're about 30 miles away from that holy spot for you right now.
Yeah. Dr. Moeller was very kind to arrange a bench being installed with Nik's name and in honor of him on the Boyce campus.
Wow.
So it's a really sweet little, when we're on campus, which one of our daughters just graduated from there, another is in her sophomore year there. So we go often, and that's just our little spot on campus where we can just.
Well, our 11-year-old lost everything. He lost his brother, his grandmother, his toys, his pets, his best friends at school, all of that loss. And we lost him for 11 months. The counselor said, Nik, your son he's so angry at God right now. He can't get to God. You're the nearest thing to a God figure in his life. And our youngest and I are a lot alike in personality. And he went to a dark place for 11 months. And thank God he's done the whole 360. But how did your daughters handle all this?
So it was difficult for our eldest daughter, Abby. She was there the night Nik passed away. So she dealt with a fair bit of PTSD from it. She started having some panic attacks and stuff. So she ended up at Boyce, thankfully, getting in touch with a counselor there who specialized in trauma. And she's comfortable with me sharing it because she believes in it enough. She actually graduated from counseling herself now.
Wow.
But she ended up needing some fairly intensive counseling to help with her PTSD. Our youngest, Michaela, I think it was similarly hardest on her because Abby was able to then go back to school and back to Boyce and be in that environment with her friends. And because of COVID here, Michaela was locked down in her bedroom
Oh,
at
my.
home with two grieving parents. And I really think that in some ways it was, uniquely difficult, let's put it that way, for her. So she's doing really well now. And we are so thankful to a number of the young women in church who came forward and took her out for meals and called her up and, asked her how she was doing. And so much of that deliberate attention from them really helped heal her, because Tim and I just weren't really capable at that point in time of deeply ministering to her in ways that she really needed to be. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges as parents when you have something happen to your one child and you're grieving and you still have your other children who need you, and yet you just have no capacity. Mm-hmm. And so really learning how to rely on the church and teaching your kids before something like this happens, how important church family is, and having them feel comfortable to go to their church community when they're struggling too, is helpful as well, I think.
One of our best friends who has been a worker overseas and our mentor and counselor, he said for married couples, of course, there's a lot of things in between, but generally, a married couple, when they lose a child, will either become much closer or they're divorced. And I know how Ruth and I handled this, but how did you all do this as a couple?
Pretty early on, somebody who reads my website sent me a letter, and he had lost his son about 10 years prior. And he sent me a long letter and sort of, apologized for sending it, but on the other hand, thought there would be some things there that would be helpful. And one of the things he laid out was the challenges to marriage. And I think one of the most helpful things he expressed was that the path to the new normal for dad, husband, will be quite different from mom, wife. And so he said, Tim, you might be, kind of 3 to 6 months, and you'll be feeling like, all right, I'm sort of through that initial wave of grief and I can press on in life now. But he said, very likely your wife will be, maybe a year or 2 years before she's ready to press on. And the challenge is going to come in that time between, where one of you is ready to press on in life, but the other is still grappling with that first front wave of grief. Mm-hmm. And so that was very helpful. And he sort of affirmed what you did, that it's going to go one of two ways, that you'll draw closer. And really, to do that, I think you just have to bow the knee to God and God's sovereignty, God's providence, to say, God has done no wrong. God did something that was within his rightful purview. We're not going to rage against God. We're going to submit to him in it, and then pull together and just say, well, what is God teaching us through this? What does God want us to do with this grief? And, not necessarily try and figure out why did God do it, but more just how can we serve God and serve his church through this grief that he's given us?
We've said in the video, I think, but one of the more painful things that we experienced in coming back to the States was the looks and the people implied that if we hadn't taken our kids to Africa, that our son would not be dead. And that was a deep wound. That was a stab through your heart. And yet when I did a little bit of research and talked to counselors again, that year, about 38,000 Americans died from the same type of attack that Timothy had, and I was hoping that doctors weren't just trying to do a mind game with me, but they said the type of attack that your son had, he'd need to be in the emergency room when he had it for us in the West to have saved his life. I find some comfort in that, but only had one doctor say that when people by the scores said or implied the other thing. And just the thought that someone thought that we had sacrificed our son when he didn't have to be sacrificed remained. They kept a wound open. It wasn't hemorrhaging, but they just kept it from healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing we realized, and we hadn't thought about this until the aftermath of Nick's death, is that people, first, they want to find a reason. They want to pin blame on someone so they can come to terms with it and realize this wouldn't happen to me. This only happened to you. It won't happen to my child. And to do that, you often pin it to a cause. And so because Nick died during the pandemic, people started thinking, well, it must have been a COVID vaccine. And that must be what he died of. Of course, the vaccine hadn't even happened yet when he died. It was well before that. But still, I think it gives people that sense of, okay, I'll blame it on that. Therefore, I don't have to think that maybe my son's heart would just mysteriously stop through just the providence of God, no real necessary cause. These things can just happen. And then we realized first, it made us think of how many times we've probably offended other people inadvertently. And I think led to some repentance and just, we don't want to do that in the future. But also just the realizing that we would be very prone to bitterness and that we would have to be very willing just to release those things and not bottle them up. Because we know we really could become embittered against people who in some ways wanted to politicize or, again, attach his death to a cause, which in our view really cheapens it. And again, pins the blame on us as people sort of might blame you as well.
My wife, I'll let her tell the particulars, but she really turned our son's death into a grace gift because our family is scattered over the world, and especially in North Africa and Middle East. And since we were supervisor of hundreds and hundreds of folks, we knew, and we did missionary kids retreats in Kenya. We were guardians for 17 missionary kids that were in boarding school about 20, 30 kilometers from us. But in the next decade and a half at least, we had colleagues that had a wife die, a husband die, a child die. My wife, having never met these people, reached out to them and just tell them some of the things that happened.
Well, I think as I was thinking about this, I thought, I don't want to waste my experience. And so I'm going to send those cards, and I still do. I keep Hallmark in business. But, I'm going to send those cards. I'm going to call. I'm going to do things. Text are great. But like you said, there's something more personal that needs to be done. And my feeling after our son's death was I feel really bad for all those people who I tried to grieve with before because I really didn't understand what they were going through. And I think God said, okay, then don't let other people fall by the wayside. But we had one of our fellow missionaries, his wife died suddenly. I found out his birthday was the same day as mine. So every year on my birthday, I send him a note. And every year on the anniversary of her death, I send him a note. And I think those are things that we can do. And I thought of another thing. You mentioned, Tim, that at the 1-year anniversary, you did get to have kind of a memorial time to celebrate Nick's death. But But a church where we were staying, they also decided on the 1 year anniversary, they were going to have a memorial time. And they made a notebook, they wrote comments, they did things that helped us realize we weren't grieving alone. And so if I could say something, Anthony, to those who are churches that really want to help their people grieve, remember those anniversaries, especially that 1 year anniversary. And people often say, well, it's been almost 25 years since your son died. Aren't you over it? Well,
it was yesterday.
And I have to say, every year the grieving is different.
Yeah.
And Nik and I grieve totally different. And 1 year he wants to talk about Timothy. He wants to share Timothy's story. And that's the year that I don't want to talk about it. I want to be by myself. I want to. And so how do we give each other the freedom as church members, as spouses, as family members, to let us grieve however the year comes? And often I will write someone and say, you're grieving differently than you've ever grieved before. And it will never, ever go away. It will always be there.
Some of my family members were angry. And I haven't talked to Ruth's sister and brother-in-law and others who were close to on her side. But coming home, I didn't really want to do it, but we went to my home church. And the president of our mission board was the pastor of our church at that time. So we've been friends for a long time. But he helped us have a memorial service months later so our families could come and our friends in America and prayer warriors could come and have a way to bring some appropriate closure for them. And it really resurfaced a lot of grieving for us, but we just know even now that was the right thing to do, is to give the body of Christ and family members a chance to grieve when really we had done most of that and had Timothy's service there in Kenya. And so we had 2 funerals, one in Africa and one in the States 4 months later.
I'd like to, Aileen and Ruth, I'd like to ask you this because I think a mom and a wife perspective would be incredibly insightful and helpful, and maybe Tim and Nik too. But for Aileen and Ruth, just being very transparent, this is a parent's worst nightmare, as I'm sure you can imagine, and people have said that before. I imagine it would be my worst nightmare as a parent. And so what did this, or has it maybe, but what has it taught you, or has it taught you to hold your children more loosely, or maybe with more open hands to God? Has it done that? If so, how? And I'm thinking maybe of my generation, younger parents who've not experienced these types of trauma and grieving and tragedies. What did this teach you about how to hold your children loosely, how to give them to God throughout their lives? Help me learn what God taught you in that.
I think right after Tim's death, I didn't want to let my other 2 out of my sight. I wanted to cling to them and hold them and not let them go places and do things. And God just reminded me that when they were born, I gave them to God. I had not, I probably did it just not even realizing what I was saying to God. That baby in my arms, that baby that had just been born, I said, God, these are your kids. I want more than anything for them to do what you want them to do. And so God had to remind me of that as I was looking at the other 2 boys, and to realize they were his. And there was nothing I could do that could make them safe. I can't make them safe. They're in God's hands. and I can make sure they don't fall and stump their toe or anything like that. But other than that, I'm not much good. And so they have to be in God's hands. And so it's a growing process. And I think often you try to take them back. And then God just has to keep reminding you, I love them more than you do, Ruth. I love them more than you do.
It was different for me. I held our kids more closely, emotionally and spiritually. I wish that I had been as close to our three boys growing up as I am to our grandsons, and I'm more tender with them, and I wish I had been more emotional. That's not the right word, but I just wish I had been more spiritually tender, expressive, warm, inclusive for those boys growing up. So it wasn't like I smothered them. It's like I became the dad that our son that died deserved to have and didn't have.
So I think that where I'm at right now, I appreciate the term process, because I think I still struggle a great deal with letting my kids go. Abby went back down to Louisville. Oh, it was 6 weeks after Nik died. And that was one of the hardest things we had to do within the whole grief process, was letting her out of our sight over a closed border and trusting that she was going to be okay. And I think day to day, it's a day-to-day struggle for me still to let my kids go, and I trust the Lord with the outcome. I'm scared of what he may ask us to walk through to get there. And so it's just the reality now. We've seen what God might choose to do, and it's hard. So yeah, I do believe I'm better than I was 4 years ago when all this happened, but it is definitely a growth process, and it's going to take a long time to not panic when I don't get a text message back right away.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask for all of you, it's more of an open-ended question, but I think maybe, and Tim, you spoke to this a little bit, but what are some things? And we've kind of asked a little similar question, but what would you challenge the church to do in these types of scenarios? Now, I know Nik and Ruth, their background, civil war and famine and persecution, and some both from personal experience, and obviously, if we read the Insanity of God, knowing these stories of believers all over the world. In full transparency, even as a ministry on our end, it is a struggle to convey to the Western church, especially. This is how we walk with people. This is how in fact, we posted this on Facebook a couple of days ago. How do you identify with someone who is in chains, in prison? Hebrews tells us to identify with them. How do we walk with people who are suffering? If we're not great at it, how can we be better? Walking with people through suffering, walking with people through grieving and loss and trauma and experiencing some of the most tragic things we can imagine. What can we do to be better about walking with people as a church family?
I think one of the interesting things that happened recently in our church is we had an older lady who passed away. And because we have such a multicultural church, a lot of people didn't know how to grieve or what was appropriate even for a funeral in Canada. And one of the things I really appreciated was that they wrote in and asked, what can we do? And then Tim ended up writing a little sort of what to do list for people. And I think just having that awareness that we have a whole bunch of different cultures coming together, and not everybody may have the same idea of what's normal in terms of a funeral protocol or things like that.
Another thing that comes to mind is, I think, first, 2 Corinthians 1, there's a special call there on people who have been comforted by God to extend that comfort to others. And so if you have been through a time of grief, especially a similar time of grief, I think you do well to receive that as being from the Lord, to receive that not just as grief, but also as responsibility, that you're now responsible to comfort others. So you need to receive comfort and then give that same comfort to others. And that's just life in the church. We are one. We're not living for our own selves, our own glory. We're living for the glory of God and the good of other people. And so just being diligent to say, well, I've been through something similar, and even though it's going to kind of arouse those old feelings and it's going to be hard, I can reach out and comfort this person. But then the other thing is that no matter what you do, grief is still going to be lonely, because nobody can really understand you other than the Lord himself. You don't even know yourself. You can't understand your own grief. You can't get into the depths of your own heart. Nonetheless, express it in a way that even the best or most gifted counselor can help you through. So I think just in that limited sense, you have to realize I'm finite, and I can't receive the kind of comfort I want to have on this side of glory. And I think that then gives us patience with our churches and patience with others to say they're doing their absolute utmost, and I praise and thank God for this. But this is going to be a heavy burden I'll carry for a lifetime, and it won't be lifted until I'm with the Lord in glory.
Amen.
I think we had grieved with so many different cultures and watched the way that they had processed that from Malawi to South Africa to Kenya. But I've not risked this before because I think that people will hear me being not flippant. Let me just tell the story. You can make your own judgment. But we're in the room, and our son had just died. And Ruth was grieving in her way, and she had almost an angelic look on her face. I don't remember our oldest son. He's so introverted, saying anything or doing anything, but I'm over weeping by our son, who has just went to his father, his real father's arms. And there was a sense of gratitude or perspective that washed over me, because those who know our stories, I did not know. I still don't know a single family in Somalia that just lost one son or just lost one daughter. Most of our experiences for 7 years was going to places where 95% of the people had lost their lives, and we listened to women for hundreds of hours and men for hundreds of hours who lost their wives, their spouse, and their children. And I just remember in my trying to touch God's heart in that place where our son had gone home, thinking, God, why are we so blessed that we've just lost one son? And that doesn't make anybody's grieving less. It's just that because of everything that, particularly for 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time, being in the midst of a famine and a civil war, and knowing that our son was in the arms of Jesus, and yet all of those thousands, I mean, we were feeding 50,000 people a day, and untold numbers that we assisted in burials, and I just couldn't understand at that moment. And again, it doesn't take away anybody's grief. I just had a different, and still do, perspective is that I hadn't known any families in our ministry setting that just lost a child, and most of them had lost a spouse. And so it didn't change the depth of my grieving for our son, and how Ruth and I and the boys grieve together, but grieving for those who have no hope because they've never heard. Our son's death gave an urgency to being obedient to Jesus, to making Christ known across the street and across the oceans. That just made us more passionate to make sure that they didn't have to die without hope.
Ruth, it looked like you might want to add something.
No, I'm good.
Oh, you did it. Well, Tim and Aileen, let me ask you this. And Nik and Ruth, if you have anything else you'd like to ask Tim and Aileen too, would love for you to ask that. But let me ask, as you have processed this, and process is a very good word. It's a continual thing that you are walking through. How does this change your outlook on ministry? How has this changed your outlook on your family, your lives, what God has called you to do, what God has asked you to do? Has it changed your outlook? And if so, how?
Yeah, one of the odd realities of grief is that I think if you process it as a Christian, you go through it for a year or two, and you realize God has done something in me. I'm a better Christian than I was before. That's not to minimize what you've been through, or not to downplay it or anything, not to say I would do it again. I mean, if we could choose, we would have our Nik back. Of course we would. On the other hand, God has done something in us, and we wouldn't want to take that back. And I think what God has done in us is he's really caused us to bow the knee to him and to say, this really is our Father's world. And we're choosing to believe day by day that he's up to something really good in this world, and that someday it'll all make sense, because it doesn't make sense right now. It doesn't make sense that either of us should lose a son in the way we did. But we can trust God with it. And we're utterly convinced that in the end, God's going to show us something so incredible, so amazing, that we'll only be able to worship him and say, you did so well, far beyond what we even could have asked or imagined. And I think, just speaking personally, there's also just this deep sense of gratitude that we get to go through this as Christians. Lots of Muslims lose a son, and lots of Buddhists and lots of Hindus and everyone else. But that very first night, when my mind was just so wrecked, the one thought that I kept having in my mind was, our God knows what it is to lose a son. He knows what it is to have his son die. What an amazing thing that our God came to earth as a man to live out the human experience. And what a amazing reality that our God, our Father, knows what it is to lose a son, and nobody else gets to have a God who's that present and that aware, a God who truly sympathizes with us in our weakness. And that was just a tremendous blessing and a tremendous comfort.
We've tried over the years to think more biblically, and probably more of the narrative from the Bible, rather than, as I was taught, to more preach and proof texts, rather than tell the stories. But the fact is that when Jesus lost a friend, he wept. But then in the midst of that grief, he did only what God could do. And he did an example or a sample of his power by raising Lazarus from the dead, as a way of showing us he can do that for anybody, whether it's in this life or in the life that's to come. But having a God that's broken, in a sense, I don't know how that works in the Father's heart, but I do know that the example of the Father through Jesus himself, that he wept over the loss of that friend and wept for that family. And I took absolute joy that Jesus modeled that for us.
Mm. Mm. Amen. Nik and Ruth, do you have anything else that you'd like to ask Tim and Aileen? You don't have to, but if you do have the question, I want to make sure you get it in there.
What is the date that we can be lifting up for you that's so special?
Yeah, it's November 3rd is the day Nik went to heaven, and March 5th is his birthday. And so
Oh my
those are the
goodness.
2 days that continue to be on our calendar, and we grieve twice a year.
We
Wow.
I'd already written one of those on my heart because our oldest, was born on November 3rd, and so that will be a good a stimulus or reminder to pray. And Ruth's birthday is March the 4th, and so I think from this side of the border, we can offer more love and more coverage and prayers for you because your dates are tied to some special dates for us, and we can remember to pray better.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
But I think that's Anthony, as I think about what can churches do, the thing that I loved the most was when people want to talk to me about my son. They want to say his name. They want to tell me memories that they have of him. And I think often as we go to visit families who are grieving, we don't know what to say. But to me, the best thing that people can do is tell a memory of my child and remind me of something he did or something he said. And so for Tim and Aileen, I want to say today, Nik's on my heart, and I look forward to remembering him and remembering him with you because I think that's so important.
And if there's one lesson we've learned from Muslims and also from believers in persecution, is the importance of allowing people to tell their story and listen to their story, and by listening, it gives life to the situation, and it's like witnessing. It should be 2/3 listening and 1/3 talking, but I think listening and giving people a chance when they are ready, and not just dump all my stuff on them. I've lost this, and I've lost this, and I've lost this, and I've lost this, thinking I'm identifying with them in their loss, but just listening. And my wife will remember the date, and when she reminds me of the date, then we will remember together the story, and no one can take those from us.
Aileen likes to say, if people bring a memory, speak about the person, say their name, you're not going to make her sad. She's sad anyways. And so really it'll bring joy, and just knowing that that person is not forgotten, because that's sort of our fear, that that person will pass out a memory altogether. And of course that'll happen for all of us someday. And everyone's memory but the Lord's, and that's fine. But right now in this life, it's so precious to know that he's remembered and remembered fondly. So I think that's universally true. Share a good memory.
That's right.
I love that. Tim and Aileen, I want to ask you one last question, because I promised we wouldn't keep you too long. Nik and Ruth, our podcast, we can go 90 minutes or 2 hours sometimes. I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to ask, because I think you guys, as Nik and Ruth do often on our podcast, Tim and Aileen, I think you can give some just really good encouragement and biblical wisdom as we depart today. I'm thinking primarily because our audience that listens to our podcast all over the world, many of them right now are in very difficult places. They're in very hostile access countries among unreached people groups, dealing with a lot of tragedy and trauma. They deal with a lot of some of life's hardest situations we can imagine. The people that are listening to this podcast and will listen to this episode, they're in those places right now, and they're walking through some of those situations right now. From what God has taught you through this journey, this process, and through your story, maybe what is some parting wisdom or encouragement you would give to our listeners today who are walking through some very, very difficult things?
Anything to say, or would you like me to?
I think probably just leaning deeply into the sovereignty of God. That's really what kept me going through all of this, is just knowing that nothing happens outside of his good and perfect will, even this. And this eventually will be a good thing. And it's never going to be something that I want, but trusting that the Lord's providence is in it. And I think that for me is what helped the most, was just really resting in his sovereignty.
As for me, I think about the times the Apostle Paul decided to inventory his sufferings. He'd write out his long list of all the things he had endured. And yet his assessment of all his sorrows and all his trials was, this is a light, momentary affliction. And that only makes sense if you have an eternal perspective and you can think, well, how good must the good be? How glorious must eternity be? If he could go through all that he endured and still count it light and momentary. And so, yeah, these things are truly weighty in the moment. We don't deny that. We don't downplay it. But getting some perspective on eternity to say, we will look back on this 10,000 times, 10,000 years from now in the bliss of eternity and say, yeah, I mean, that was hard, but that was light, momentary compared to the glory we're now enjoying in the presence of the Lord.
Wow. Incredible. Well, Tim and Aileen, I want to thank you so much. This has been a very, very powerful conversation, and we pray that it blesses numerous people around the world. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for carving out some time to come onto our podcast and share this story. I know it probably is never easier, but it's so evident how God has used your story. And I love it because just like Nik and Ruth, God has used tragedy to bring about the growth of his kingdom, and the growth of his kingdom, not just in one place, but around the world. And so we're so thankful for you and your transparency and sharing your story and joining us today and allowing us to not just ask questions, but really hear what God has been doing in your hearts and your lives. We really, really appreciate you being with us on the show today. And Nik and Ruth, thank you. We don't always have both of you together. It's usually just Nik. And so Ruth, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your insight. And Tim, you're probably like Nik, is that you have a better 2/3 next to you. And so you're just kind of an added bonus, but really the stars of the show are Ruth and Aileen. But we want to thank all of you for being with us today. To our listeners, if you would like to learn more about Tim's ministry and Tim and Aileen's story, you can go to www.challies.com. That's CHALLIES.com. And you can also find on his website ways to purchase his book, Seasons of Sorrow. To encourage our listeners to go out and find that book and read more about their story and more about Nik's life and what God has done in this journey. And for our listeners, to learn more information about Nik Ripken Ministries, you can go to our website, www.nikripken.com. We are so grateful that you joined us today, and we'll be with you next time.